Hi, and welcome to episode 9 of the Political Pulse. Today we'll be interviewing distinguished Professor John Phillimore from Curtin about the upcoming federal election.
Welcome, Professor Phillimore, to Studio Scotch's Political Pulse.
Great to be here.
You're a distinguished professor from Curtin University and spent time studying politics at Oxford. Could you give us a brief background on, your life in Australian politics?
Sure. I did politics and history at UWA. I went to Christchurch. Sorry, I have to say that at a Scotch College podcast. But yes, I did. I went to Christchurch. I had a scholarship to go there, and then I went to UWA, did politics and history, and was very lucky to get a Rhodes Scholarship. And so I went to Oxford. And at Oxford, I mixed with quite a few interesting people, including Tony Abbott, future Prime Minister of Australia. Tony and I used to play tennis and various things. We always knew he was going to go far, but we weren't quite sure he was going to be Prime Minister. He was pretty famous or infamous, depending on your point of view. And then after I did my politics, I did another politics degree at Oxford with slightly different focus. Came back to Australia and worked for 4 years for the Deputy Premier of Western Australia at the time in the state Labor government. And then I went off and did my PhD in Britain again. So I lived through the Thatcher's Britain in the late 1980s, very interesting period of time. Came back to Perth, spent 10 years as an academic, and then I worked for 6 years in politics again as a chief of staff to another government minister, and then I went to Curtin about not quite 20 years ago. So I've sort of gone in and out between universities and actually doing politics or doing policy, working for government in Western Australia. So, but the last 18, 19 years I've basically been at university. But occasionally, of course, I do keep connected. And you probably ask me about this later on, but I've been on a couple of government committees advising on various aspects of politics in Western Australia, but also I keep my hand in on Australian politics too. So back and forth, and I've sort of come across some interesting characters like Tony Abbott.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, well, Tony Abbott, I can't tell you all the stories about Tony Abbott on a podcast like this, but if you talk to me later on, I'll give you a few nice stories about him. It's okay.
Oh, very interesting. But we're going to move on to our questions now. So first questions will be around the legislative councils and WA state election. So what were your reflections on the outcome of the Western Australian election, and what impact will Basel Simplest have on the Liberal Party?
Okay, well, the state election, I think everybody knew pretty much from 4 years ago what the result was going to be this time around. Everyone pretty much expected that Labor would get re-elected, and they duly did. I think the only real question was how big was the margin going to be, and I think people were a bit surprised that it was such a comfortable victory. Really, I think the benchmark or the threshold that was set for the Liberals was to go back to 2017, where they were defeated pretty badly. But they thought if they could get back to that, they might have a chance next time around. But they didn't even do as well as 2017. So Labor improved its performance on 2017. Nobody expected them to match 2021, the COVID election. That was never going to happen. But so Labor did very well. The Liberals have just become the opposition by one seat. So they are really in the doldrums at state level. Now Basel Simplest just squeaked into his seat, but he's a pretty well-known figure. I'm not surprised it was difficult for him first time around. I mean, Roger Cook, the Premier, only won his seat by about 300 votes back in 2008. So you can sometimes just sneak in and then you sort of consolidate and do well. So I think that will happen with Basel Simplest. He's a pretty well-known figure. I think he's good with the media. I think he'll do okay, but he's got a long way to catch up and a lot to learn. There's only one member of the Liberal Party in the Parliament, in the lower house, who's ever been in Parliament before. That's Libby Mettam. So the other 6 members have never been there. So that's it's like first day at school. You got to learn how to do these things, and it's not going to be easy for them. They've come from different walks of life, but I think that'll be a bit tricky for him. But I think he'll be a reasonably impressive figure. I think he'll learn pretty quickly.
It is always good to get that knowledge on what is going in our own backyard, I think.
Yeah, and Basel, I mean, the good thing about Basel Simplest to some extent is he's been the Lord Mayor of Perth, City of Perth. Now, it's not a huge city, of course, not a huge position in some respects. The City of Perth's only got 10,000 people, but it's a big, it's an important job, quite well known, and he's had to sort of do some governing, if you like, as the Lord Mayor of that, had to deal with different factions on the council. So that's an important thing. So he's got some experience. He's not just a football journalist, boundary rider at the AFL. He's actually had to do some other work too. So I think in that sense, he's had a good apprenticeship to some extent, as much as you can. Maybe he would have preferred to just come in and be an MP to start with, but he's been thrown in. He's the leader. He's going to have to deal with it now. I think he's got as good a chance as anybody.
Okay.
What impact did the changes to the Legislative Council voting system have on the recent election?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll declare an interest. I was on the expert committee that advised the government about changing the Legislative Council. Not everybody would know this, but the Legislative Council has basically been controlled. Well, Labor's never had the majority in the Legislative Council for 100 years. It's never had it. And that's primarily because it used to have what's called vote weighting towards regional areas. West Australia's a big state, and for a long time, people who live in regional areas of West Australia would have their vote would be worth more than people living in the city. So there were 6 regions, each had 6 members, but 3 of those regions were for regional West Australia. So 75% of people live in Perth, 25% live in the regions, but 50% of the seats were coming from Perth and 50% were coming from the regions, i.e. there was vote weighting. The Labor Party has always complained about this and seen it as undemocratic. And so when they got this first time ever majority in the upper house, they decided that they would change the voting system. And so our committee recommended and the government accepted that we would have a different way of voting. And basically now you've got one big electorate called Western Australia, and you elect 37 members of parliament, and they use what's called a proportional representation system. So if you do your politics classes and you know about first past the post and preferential voting, this is a proportional representation system. So if you get 3% of the vote, you'll get 1 seat, and if you get 50% of the vote, you'll get 50% of the seats. And so that's what happened. It got quite a lot of criticism, and people are worried that there'll be lots and lots of minor parties. But the way it's turned out, I think it will be manageable. Labor won't have a majority, but it didn't win a majority of the votes. It got 42% of the votes in the Legislative Council. It's going to get about 42% of the seats. The Greens got 10 or 12% of the vote. They'll get 4 seats, and the National Party got 5% of the vote. They'll get 2 seats, etc. So it will be representative of the West Australian community, and so that does mean that the government won't have a majority, and that'll make a big difference over the next 4 years. Up to now, the last 4 years, Labor basically had a big majority, obviously a huge majority in the lower house, and its own had a majority in the upper house, so therefore it could get its legislation through. No questions asked, not as much scrutiny as you would expect or hope maybe, and so this time around there'll be more scrutiny of legislation to try and get that through the Parliament. So it's a good thing.
Moving towards the federal election.
Sure, that's the big moment at the moment. Yeah, that's the big discussion at the moment.
Everyone's worried about what's going to go on. What seats do you think Dutton and Albanese are going to be targeting, and where is there going to be conflict over those more major swing seats?
Yeah, well, I mean, Labor is only ahead by, it's got nominally, because there's been a redistribution, it's got 78 seats out of 150. So it only needs to lose 3 seats and it's lost its majority. So basically every seat's important from a Labor's point of view. Like, it's a bit different though for Peter Dutton, because he comes from a long way behind, because there's also 14 independents, so or Greens or independents. So he needs to win like 19 seats to win. So the strategy is probably a little bit different for the two of them. Labor will be trying to hold on to all its seats, which will be tricky. And whereas Dutton, I think, will be trying to find sort of particular areas in general where he can maybe pick up big numbers of seats. So for him, that's the outer suburbs in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, because that's where he needs to win, because they've got all the population. And Melbourne and Victoria is really big for Peter Dutton, because traditionally, for the last 20 years, Labor has been very strong in Victoria. They sometimes call it the Massachusetts of Australia, because Massachusetts, if you don't know, is what they call liberal, i.e. what we'd call sort of more progressive state in the US. And Victoria's been like that. It's had a Labor government for, apart from 4 years, for about the last 30 years, and it's tended to vote very strongly Labor. Its state government is on the nose at the moment, and there's a lot of complaints and issues in Victoria. And so Peter Dutton would see he'd have a big chance to pick up some seats there. He'd also be looking at West Australia. I mean, West Australia traditionally, until the last election, was a very solid Liberal state at the federal level. We usually have 15 seats and the Liberals would have 10 of them and Labor would have 5. It's been flipped around this time. So we now have in fact 16 seats. Labor has 10. The coalition has 5, and there's one independent, Kate Cheney, which I think is probably in this seat right here, Curtin.
Yeah,
I
it
think
is,
it's
yeah.
where Scotch
Indeed,
is. That's
Curtin
right.
seat, yeah.
So you've got the Liberals have only got 5 out of 16, which is unheard of, really, for the last 30 years. So Peter Dutton will be very keen to try and pick up a few seats here in WA. I don't think he's expecting to pick up all 5 of those ones that he lost, but he'd be looking to certainly pick up Curtin because it's only held by 1%. And there's a couple of other ones here in WA he'd be very keen to win. Tangney is a seat sort of in South Perth, around that sort of southern part of, down near Applecross, around that area there, which again was a very strong Liberal seat. Up till recently had 60% of the two-party preferred vote. Liberals were a very solid seat, but last time Labor won it, and they're about with a margin of about 3%. So that's a very unusual thing for Labor to win a seat like Tangney. So the Liberals will be looking for that one. And then there's a few outer suburban seats which sometimes just swing, because that's the way Australia swings if there's a big swing against the government because of interest rates or inflation or something else. So I would think that Peter Dutton will be focused on Victoria, Sydney, because that's where all the people are, and West Australia because he sees this as his backyard, and he can't work out why the Liberal Party lost it last time, so they're going to try and win it back.
So it's really that Tangnian seat that we got to look out for in this election. That's where the conflict's going to be. What I've heard is that last year during August, he said, while on an interview, he said that he doesn't want to accept any refugees from Gaza anymore. This being very controversial and people thinking that he's following in Trump's footsteps. Do you think that because he said that, it's not going to help him very much in this election?
Yeah, I think so. That's his issues. I think he's got, on the one hand, he wants to sort of follow some of the lead. I mean, so for example, he's talking about cutting public servants in a big way. I mean, where's he getting that from? Elon Musk and Doge, where they're going around and cutting public servants in Washington. So there might be other reasons for it, but it would look a bit like that's what he's following Trump's footsteps. Same with pretty harsh on Gaza, and there may be other aspects of Trump's policy that he's also, even if he's not literally sort of following what Trump's got to say, you could always associate it as being along the same lines. And so I think that's what Labor will try and do, and try and pin him down as say, well, if not Peter Dutton, some of his supporters, Trump, not just Trump light, but Trump sort of supporters. So he'll have to sort of navigate through that. So I think the Trump aspect is something we hadn't really thought about until quite recently, and especially in Canada. I mean, if you not followed Canadian politics very carefully, but Justin Trudeau has just resigned. Everybody thought he resigned because his party was looking so bad in the polls. There's no way they were going to win. So a bit of a desperation thing. They've now got a new Prime Minister, and they might look like they could even pull it off because Canada's being hit so much by Trump. The whole 51st state, thing that they've talked about. Trump saying, Canada should be 51st state. And so Canada, has sort of stood up for themselves and said, no, we're going to push back. And so that can actually make people feel good. And so the Liberal Party, which is, if you like, the more progressive party in Canada, is actually looking like it might even win the election, whereas their Conservative opponents were much more Trumpian, are now on the back foot. So it hasn't got to that stage yet in Australia, but wouldn't take too much, I think, for that to sort of kick into the campaign.
And we've sort of seen with Peter Dutton struggling, we've seen Albanese come in with those new sort of ideas in his campaign. And one of those has been strongly focusing about Medicare and his bulk billing idea, trying to reduce the cost of visiting a GP. Do you think that this is going to be effective in helping him sort of persuade his electorates and persuade the election towards his favour a bit more?
I mean, what both big parties try to do is to get the campaign talking about issues that they are seen to be the more safe bet. So Labor likes to have elections talking about Medicare because Medicare is a Labor thing. Labor created Medicare under Bob Hawke. Years before that, Medibank got for them, but Labor sees Medicare as its thing. And so therefore, if they're talking about Medicare, if the campaign's about Medicare, Labor will feel comfortable and confident because they think people say, Medicare, that's Labor. Just like traditionally, the coalition is, if they can get the conversation to be about taxes or about defence or immigration, then they'll feel like they're winning if the conversation's about that, because they are often seen as the party that people feel more comfortable with in discussing those issues. So I think for Albanese, he's keen to come up with a big health policy to try and get it on his turf. That's why I think Dutton decided just to match Albanese's policy straight away, because he didn't want the discussion to be about Medicare. So he said, yep, fine, tick, we'll go along with what you've said there. Cost a lot of money, but he's just said yes, which is why the tax one is quite interesting, because Albanese sort of pulled that out of the hat. Nobody's expecting that, or Jim Chalmers, that tax cut, and it put the Liberals on the back foot, and they are now in this strange position where they have said they will vote, well, they voted against it last week, and they've said they will repeal the tax cut, which is an unliberal thing to do. So it's got people a little bit scratching their head about that. So often the policy is important, but often it's also the presentation and even just the agenda setting. You know, you try and set the agenda. Let's talk about health. That's a good thing for Labor. Let's talk about, I don't know, crime, or about immigration and restricting numbers of immigrants. That's a good thing for the coalition. The conversation is as much, just the topic of conversation is as important as actually the content of the conversation. It shouldn't be like that, but a lot of people don't pay attention to politics. You guys do, but a lot of people don't. And so if they just hear, the big issue in the campaign is health. Well, Labor's probably pretty safe for health. I'll vote them. If the big issue is about immigration, well, probably the coalition's a bit stronger on that, so I'll vote for them. So people need to sometimes be sort of given pointers as to what the election's about, and that's why these other issues are a bit more neutral. Cost of living, okay, is sort of a Liberal issue, but on the other hand, Labor is prepared to spend a bit more and has been giving people handouts to help them and saying it's not really our fault, it's an international thing to do with Ukraine and other aspects. So therefore, that's a more neutral territory, and they're trying to work out, well, who's going to be blamed for it and also who can deal with it in the future. So that's sort of where I think Albanese's pulled that out of the hat, basically by saying health, that's me.
And that sort of shows a bias towards who we're voting for in an election.
Well, it's not so much a bias. It's sort of saying you can see why, if it's a competition, you're trying to get people to vote for you. So you say, well, just remember, guys, we're the party who thinks who you can trust health with, or just remember, people, we're the people you can trust defence with, etc. So it's to try and make people vote for all sorts of reasons. And of course, an election is just one vote, and it covers the whole range of things that governments do. So what's going to be uppermost in people's minds when they're voting, we don't quite know. But one way to do that is to say, well, of all the different things you might want to care about, we think the one you really should care about most is X. And by the way, we're best at X. In this case, Albany is saying we're best at health. Make this a health election. Dutton's going to try and say, no, it's not a health election. It's something else. Vote for us. So it's a positioning type thing as much as sort of a bias thing. You can see why different parties tend to have different interests. If you're the Greens, you're going to make it about environment, or in their case, they've made housing a big thing. You're young guys down the track, you'd be looking for houses and stuff and renting. The Greens have tried to make housing and rentals a big issue for them. They're trying to own that issue because neither of the big parties is really doing much about that. So that's the way you try and position yourself.
And it'll be interesting to watch going on in the election how these seats end up turning out.
That's right. And if it turns out that, there's every chance we have a minority government, which we have had before, but only once in living memory. And some people think this is a terrible thing. It's terrible to have a minority government. But there's plenty of countries have minority governments, or coalition governments, effectively. And they manage to, survive reasonably well. And if the population aren't all that keen on either of the two major parties, well, guess what? You're going to have a minority government. So I think on election night, it'll be, we may not know the result on election night. We might know that neither party's got a majority, and then we have to find out who are the Teals and other independents going to actually support. And that's something we don't really know. That'll really put the pressure on them. Say, okay, what if Labor's got 70 seats and the coalition's got 69 seats, and there are, whatever that leaves us, a lot of independents. What are they going to do then? So people, of course, they are doing their best to not reveal who they're going to vote for because they want to keep the options open. But that'll be tough to find out. It's happened once before, like I said, in 2010, and they spent about 2.5 weeks before the three independents who had the balance of power decided who they were going to go with. They went with Julia Gillard and Labor Party. This time around, it could take us another 2.5 weeks to find out who's going to be the Prime Minister if it gets that close, and it may well be.
So, building on this idea of the budget, we're going to look at Liberals' perspective. Now, when Peter Dutton gave his speech, he really focused on like two major things being like gas and tax cuts. Do you think that his tax cut that he's proposing to do now is going to have a significant impact on him winning the election?
You mean the fuel excise cut?
Yeah, the fuel
potentially?
excise.
Yeah, I mean, he's taking that out of John Howard's playbook. John Howard did this back in the early 2000s. And I mean, on the one hand, I think it's I think a clever piece of politics in some respects, because it targets the areas where he wants to get seats. And the people who will be benefiting most are going to be people who drive a lot in the outer suburbs, who often don't have electric cars, for example. So if you've got an electric car, you get nothing out of this. And where most of the people with electric cars at the moment, they're in places like Curtin, in the inner cities, or people who are better off, or people who live close in the cities and catch public transport.
Yeah.
So I think it's a reasonably clever practice of targeting the voters he needs, because he's trying to win those outer suburb seats. The gas one is a tricky one to explain to people, but I think it's got some legs in terms of saying, well, if you get more gas in the market, the price will come down. But it's not a direct cost of living cut. It's more, promise me the prices will come down in due course. It's not completely certain, but maybe they will. So I think really and he had to have something. He had to have something to match a tax cut, and so that's what he came up with. Whether people will buy it, I don't know, but that was his. You're right. That's the two policies he came up with. I'm not 100% convinced that they'll both fly. In WA, the gas one doesn't really work because we've already got this thing. What he was really saying is it's called a domestic gas reservation policy. In other words, Australia's got lots of gas.
Yeah.
And we export it mostly. And he's saying, well, we should reserve some for domestic use, both for industry and for consumers. WA's had that policy for almost 20 years. It was, in fact, the Labor government introduced it back in 2006. So in that sense, it's hard for Labor to argue against that policy because it's already happened in Western Australia. In the eastern states, it hasn't happened, and so they're sitting on vast amounts of gas, and it's all going overseas because they pay high prices. And people locally can't get gas. They're actually going to have to either import it or pay a lot more money for it. And so I think you can see why he's making the argument. Whether it will work in the time frame he's talking about is another matter. So, I think it made sense going down that way, but it's a hard one to explain, in a 30-second grab on a TV commercial.
Okay.
Sort of summing up the whole thing today, do we see, in your opinion, do we see Albanese continue on with his tenure, or does Peter Dutton come in, or are we going to have that very limited opportunity of a hung parliament?
Well, I'm not going to predict right now because with 3 days into the campaign, the momentum seems to be going with Albanese. I mean, the historically important thing to think about is, if Albanese loses, that would be a huge shock historically. There hasn't been a first-term government lose since 1931. So here we are.
Okay.
So since then, a government has been re-elected ever since 1931. However, at the same time, since about 1970, every government loses votes and seats at their second election.
Oh, okay.
So Albanese's only got a 3-seat majority.
Yeah.
So if he does what every other government's done over the last 30 years and lose seats, well, guess what? We're heading for minority government. I think the other stat is that, for 30-odd years, no opposition leader, first-time opposition leader, has ever won. So if you lose, you become the opposition. Your opposition leader, who's elected, never becomes Prime Minister. This doesn't happen. I mean, so basically, it'll be an absolute first for Dutton to win and become Prime Minister, and it'll be a first because Labor would have lost after one term. And however, what's pretty likely is that they may well lose seats. So the only solution then is, the only way you can square all those circles, is that you have a minority Labor government. So that's probably the most likely thing, Albanese Prime Minister, but relying on support from maybe the Greens and maybe one or two of the independents. But there's a long way to go before then.
Okay. Well, that's all very interesting, and I'm really happy to have you on here. So thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Political Pulse.
It's been great to be here, and good luck with your studies, and we'll be following the election. Pity you guys can't vote just yet. If it had been held later in the year, could you have voted?
No, we're all
Next year.
2026, yeah.
Next year.
Okay. Well, when you do get to vote, do it and make sure you take it seriously. It's an important thing that we have. I think compulsory voting is a great thing, and it really means that people have to pay attention. And it's not a huge impulse to go and vote. Every 3 years or every 4 years. You just got to turn up, vote, and leave. And you go place, do whatever you like afterwards. So I think Australia's got a great system in that sense, and hopefully you guys will use it wisely when you get your chance. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.